Almost everyone recognizes this face. It's Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States. In fact, Abraham Lincoln has become a part of almost every aspect of our lives. Think about it. Across the country, there are Lincoln streets, roads, and avenues. There are countless Lincoln grade schools, high schools, and universities. There are Lincoln parks and statues. There are towns and cities named after him. In fact, Lincoln's name or likeness can be found on virtually anything and everything, from restaurants to cars, even toys and pennies. There are businesses, companies, and organizations of virtually every description that carry the name Lincoln. And in our nation's capital, one of the most breathtaking monuments ever created is dedicated to the memory of Abraham Lincoln.
Have you ever wondered why? What was it about Abraham Lincoln that inspired so many lasting tributes, both big and small? And what do we really know about Abraham Lincoln? Over the years, there have been all sorts of stories told about him. And even in his time, there were many conflicting tales about this man named Abraham Lincoln.
Was he really born in a log cabin? Did he truly split logs for rail fences? Was he stronger than any three men? How honest was he? Did he truly oppose slavery? Or was he hated by the abolitionists of his day? Was he the overwhelming choice to lead our country through one of its most trying times? Or was he lucky to be elected with less than a majority of the popular vote? Was his speech at Gettysburg recognized as one of the greatest tributes of democracy? Or was it, at the time, largely ignored? Today, his memory is revered throughout the land. But was he always so popular? And how did he die? Assassinated by a single individual acting alone? Or murdered as part of a larger conspiracy?
To help find answers to these questions, we will be relying largely upon the Lincoln materials from the Indiana Historical Society, one of the premier Lincoln collections in the United States. And I think you'll find that some of the answers may surprise you as we take a look at Abraham Lincoln, the myth, the legend, and the man.
This is the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. Without a doubt, one of the most magnificent memorials in the world, built of the finest marble, bronze, and Indiana limestone. But its splendor is quite a contrast to Abraham Lincoln's early days. It's been said that Abraham Lincoln was born in a log cabin, and on February 12, 1809, he probably was. Very possibly in a log cabin much like this one near Hodgenville, Kentucky. Young Abraham Lincoln lived in Kentucky with his mother, father, and sister until he was 7 years old. Then the family moved to southwestern Indiana. The family's early days in Indiana were a struggle, and in 1818, Nancy Lincoln, Abraham's mother, died. A year later, his father, Thomas Lincoln, married again. His second wife was Sarah Bush Johnson, a widow from Kentucky. Abraham Lincoln spent most of his youth in Spencer County, Indiana. It's been said that Abraham Lincoln acquired his early education by reading by the fireside in a small southern Indiana cabin. And it's true, he spent very little of his time in school. Indeed, Abraham Lincoln's formal schooling probably totaled less than a year. But as a young boy, he had an almost insatiable thirst for knowledge. Books were scarce on the Indiana frontier. The Bible was one of the few books the Lincolns owned. and Abraham came to know it thoroughly. He also walked miles to buy or borrow books, and he somehow got his hands on many classics: Robinson Crusoe, Pilgrim's Progress, Aesop's Fables, and a book about George Washington that he would remember throughout his life.
I got hold of a small book, such as one as few of the younger members have ever seen, Weem's Life of Washington. I remember all the accounts there given of the battlefields and struggles for the liberties of the country. And you all know, for you have all been boys, how these early impressions last longer than any others. I recollect thinking then, boy, even though I was, that there must have been something more than common that those men struggled for.
Lincoln developed from early on, whether it was academic pursuits or physical labor, a good, strong work ethic that I think you could credit to his family and his community. You needed that strong work ethic to survive, and so then he carried that through in his education.
Typically, Lincoln was not a quick study, but he was a very thorough study. He would take books and he would ponder them. He would just pore over them until, in many ways, he virtually had memorized it. And this was Lincoln's approach to learning that lasted him all the way through the presidency.
Legend has it that Abraham Lincoln was unusually strong, and in fact, he did develop great physical strength early on, even though he was tall and gangly. Local farmers liked to hire him because his strength made him unusually good at cutting wood and splitting rails for fences. Hence, in later years, people would come to refer to him as the rail splitter. He also showed an early knack for public speaking, telling stories, and doing impersonations. And as a young man, he often kept people entertained at the local general store in Gentryville.
There'd be maybe a traveling minister come through, and Lincoln would sometimes mimic a sermon he had just heard. But that was a way to entertain one another. And his father, from what I understand, was also quite a storyteller as well.
And here's where Lincoln often crossed the line from being humorous to being hurtful. His humor cut both ways. If you weren't the brunt of the joke, of course it was funny, but oftentimes if you were the object of Lincoln's humor, which was really meant in a hurting way, it could be quite devastating.
The Ohio River flowed just 15 miles from Lincoln's Indiana home, and it held a strong attraction for the young Abraham Lincoln. At the age of 19, he took his first trip away from home, aboard a flatboat loaded with farm goods down the river to New Orleans. Then, in 1830, Abraham Lincoln's father decided to move again, this time to Illinois. Abraham was 21 now and eager to strike out on his own. But he first helped his father plant crops and build a cabin in Illinois.
When Abraham Lincoln began life on his own, he began it here in New Salem, Illinois. The building you see behind me is a reconstruction of Denton Offutt's store where Lincoln worked as a clerk, and the events of his life began to move more quickly.
Within a few months, he had enlisted in the Illinois militia to fight in the Black Hawk War. Although he saw no action, he had earned the respect of his comrades, who elected him captain prior to their departure from New Salem, which was quite an honor for a young man who had lived in the community for just 9 months. Several years later, he wrote this about himself.
When the Black Hawk War of 1832 broke out, Abraham joined a volunteer company, and to his own surprise, was elected captain of it. He says he has not since had any success in life which gave him so much satisfaction.
We often think of Abraham Lincoln as a very successful man in politics. After all, he became the 16th president of the United States. But the truth is, Abraham Lincoln also lost elections, and his first defeat occurred while he lived here in New Salem. Before volunteering for military service, Abraham Lincoln had become a candidate for the state legislature. The election was held just 2 weeks after his return to New Salem from the Black Hawk War, and Abraham Lincoln was defeated. Yet, here in his community, where people had come to know him, he had received 277 votes out of a total of 300 votes cast. But he still faced the challenge of earning a living. When a chance came to buy a store on credit, Abraham Lincoln and a colleague, William F. Berry, bought it. Unfortunately, the business was a dismal failure.
Years later, Abraham Lincoln wrote about his business venture in a brief autobiography.
Before long, strangely enough, a man offered to sell, and did sell to Abraham and another as poor as himself, an old stock of goods upon credit. They opened as merchants, and he says that was the store. Of course, they did nothing but get deeper and deeper in debt.
After his business partner died, Lincoln was left with the enormous debt of $1,100. Although it took several years, he eventually repaid every penny. And this is one of the reasons he earned his nickname, Honest Abe. He was appointed postmaster of New Salem and later became a surveyor. Then, in 1834, he won his first election to the Illinois State Legislature. Lincoln proved to be an effective legislator. He was witty and ready to debate. He served 4 successive 2-year terms, and he made his first public statement on slavery, introducing a resolution that stated, "The institution of slavery is founded on both injustice and bad policy." He also began to study law. At that time, there were few law schools, and most people learned the law by studying or reading the law with a practicing attorney. Abraham Lincoln, however, taught himself, sometimes walking the 20 miles from New Salem to Springfield just to borrow books.
If you are resolutely determined to make a lawyer of yourself, the thing is more than half done already. It is but a small matter whether you read with anybody or not. I did not read with anyone. Get the books and read and study them till you understand them in their principal features. That is the main thing. It is of no consequence to be in a large town while you are reading. I read at New Salem, which never had 300 people living in it. The books and your capacity for understanding them are just the same in all places. Now, always bear in mind that your own resolution to succeed is more important than any other thing.
In 1837, the state capital of Illinois moved to Springfield, and Abraham Lincoln moved there as well, riding on horseback and carrying everything he owned in his saddlebags. It was here, in Springfield, that Abraham Lincoln began practicing law.
And it was also here that he met Mary Todd, a young girl from Kentucky with whom he was quite taken. Eventually, they were married.
After their first son, Robert, was born, the Lincolns moved here. It was to be the only home the Lincolns ever owned.
Their second son, Edward, was born in 1846, but died when he was almost 4. Six months of the year, Abraham Lincoln would travel the circuit. That means he would ride from county to county in central Illinois to try cases. It was during this time that he had many opportunities to meet new people, and his knack for storytelling seems to have made an impression, as did his skill as a lawyer.
The cases Lincoln took started out as simple sort of cases, maybe disputes over livestock or other, maybe some domestic cases. As the railroad industry started to grow more and more during this time period, by the 1850s, certainly he was taking on both for representing railroads and also involved in cases against the railroads, and demanding pretty hefty fees for his services as well. But while he was doing those big-time cases, he also would continue to take the smaller ones, just the kind of workaholic he was at that time.
Lincoln believed that law was a tool for mediation, for settling disputes among neighbors. He argued that people ought to try to resolve these disputes on their own. But when that had been exhausted and there was still no resolution, then that was the proper venue for the courts.
It was also during this time that Abraham Lincoln began to act on his ambitions for national political office. And in 1846, he ran for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives and won. He emphasized his position on slavery by supporting legislation that would have outlawed slavery in any territory acquired from Mexico. However, during his term, he opposed the Mexican War, which likely alienated him from the voters in his home district. And when his term ended, he did not run for re-election because of an agreement he had with colleagues in his party to take turns running for office.
Lincoln returned to his home in Springfield, and his law practice began to flourish. Operating from this office, he became one of the most successful lawyers in Central Illinois. For a time, Lincoln believed that his political life was over, but a change in national policy towards slavery caused him to reconsider. It came in the form of a bill introduced by Stephen A. Douglas, a senator from Illinois, called the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
Well, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, basically, as Stephen Douglas envisioned it and wrote it, would leave it up to the Western territories to vote for or against slavery as they saw fit. And Lincoln became outraged at this. Basically, what this would do would be a potential, as Lincoln saw it, would be to nationalize slavery. And Lincoln saw those earlier compromises limiting the expansion of slavery as a way that slavery would ultimately end. Kansas-Nebraska Act would reverse that trend as Lincoln saw it.
Abraham Lincoln, like many others, believed that slavery had been permanently limited by the Missouri Compromise. And he resolved to return to politics to do what he could to reverse the Kansas-Nebraska Act. In 1854, Abraham Lincoln campaigned as a congressional candidate opposed to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Later, he was again elected to the Illinois legislature, but he resigned to run for the United States Senate. At that time, senators were elected by the state legislature, and Lincoln withdrew to support another, more electable candidate who was opposed to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. In 1856, Abraham Lincoln joined the newly formed Republican Party. And in 1858, he was nominated by the Republican Party to run against Stephen A. Douglas for the United States Senate.
Abraham Lincoln took the nomination very seriously, and it marked a change in his political career. Previously, he had worked mostly in the interests of his party and to represent the people of his district. Now his work began to focus on the issues affecting the entire nation.
He may have prepared the speech to accept the nomination at this desk in his home, and rehearsed it before other party members in a downstairs room of the Illinois State Capitol building. Many believed his words were too bold, too inflammatory.
But Abraham Lincoln delivered it nonetheless, here in the chambers of the Illinois State Legislature.
A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it'll cease to be divided. It'll become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south.
The core of the House divided speech involved the issue of slavery. What was Lincoln's personal view on slavery? Did he want to do away with slavery altogether? In truth, his attitudes may have changed over time.
Following his acceptance speech, Abraham Lincoln challenged Stephen Douglas to a series of debates. Held throughout Illinois, these debates gave each man a chance to define his views on the extension of slavery into the Western territories. And a fundamental difference emerged. Abraham Lincoln believed that slavery was a moral, social, and political evil, while Stephen Douglas believed that it didn't matter whether slavery was morally right or wrong. For him, the issue was that people living in a territory had the right to decide for themselves the question of slavery.
Many of the major newspapers from New York, Philadelphia, sent reporters out to cover these debates. So they followed Lincoln and Douglas throughout the state, recording their words because they knew, Lincoln knew that this would get national attention because of Douglas and Douglas's presidential aspirations. And he felt that this was the best way to not only make the case for the Republican platform, but it's also a way to promote his own visibility within the National Party.
Stephen Douglas won the election, but the debates made Lincoln a national figure. And in 1860, the Republican Party nominated Lincoln as its candidate for president. The opposing Democratic Party split into two factions, which helped Lincoln greatly by dividing the Democratic vote between two candidates. This situation is illustrated in this political cartoon published at the time. It shows Lincoln's engine about to run over a wagon driven in two directions by his Democratic opponents. In addition, a fourth contender ran as the candidate for what was called the Constitutional Union Party.
Like most politicians of his day, Abraham Lincoln believed that it was undignified to actively campaign, so others spoke for him. He received word of his election as President of the United States at the telegraph office in Springfield and returned home only after the results were known. He had been elected with the majority of electoral votes, yet all of them were from the North. In fact, more voters had voted for Lincoln's three opponents combined than had voted for him.
Following the election, events in the South moved quickly. During the campaign, many Southern leaders had threatened to withdraw their states from the Union if Lincoln was elected. And before Abraham Lincoln had even left for Washington, South Carolina had seceded, withdrawn from the Union. 6 other states followed before Lincoln was sworn into office, and another 4 states later withdrew from the Union. Together, these 11 states formed themselves into the Confederate States of America.
With Lincoln's nomination and later his election, what the South was reacting to was less Lincoln. Most of them didn't know who he was. What they were reacting to was what the Republican Party stood for in its platform. What Lincoln's election represented for them was the fact that the clock was really starting to tick. And therefore, they had a choice. They could either wait for a slow death in loss of power, in loss of what they had invested in as their way of life, or they could do they could secede and hopefully remove themselves from the compact of states, set up their own government, and hopefully would be able to do it without northern armies invading them.
On February 11, 1861, Abraham Lincoln said goodbye to his neighbors and friends in Springfield, leaving on a train from this depot.
Here I have lived a quarter of a century, and have passed from a young man to an old man. Here my children have been born, one is buried. I now leave, not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington. Without the assistance of that divine being who ever attended him, I cannot succeed. With that assistance, I cannot fail.
The journey took 12 days, with many stops along the way. Lincoln took the oath of office on March 4, 1861. In his inaugural address, he sought to reassure the South that he did not plan to interfere with slavery.
I declare that I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so.
So he offered in his inaugural address the hope of peace, but he was also very firm in saying that you know, it's up to you guys, is what he was saying to the South, and you know, if you decide to go this route, to go secession, then I am honor bound to maintain this union and try to hold it together with however I may need to do that.
Even though he vowed not to interfere with slavery, Lincoln also warned the Southern states that had already seceded that he would use the full power of the nation to hold, occupy, and possess the property and places that belonged to the federal government. One of those places was Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Union soldiers occupied the fort, and the Confederates demanded their surrender, which was refused. Following an extended standoff, the Confederate artillery fired on the fort and forced the Union troops to surrender. The Civil War had begun. Lincoln was quick to act. He called out the militia and began to expand the army. Without waiting for congressional approval, he ordered the spending of federal funds. And in order to control Southern sympathizers in the North, he suspended the writ of habeas corpus, a fundamental constitutional right that says that people must be charged with a specific crime when arrested. For this, he was bitterly criticized by Roger B. Taney, the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Yet, Lincoln believed his actions were justified in order to preserve the Union.
Are all the laws but one to go unexecuted, and the government itself go to pieces, lest that one be violated?
Both the Union and Confederate states raised armies, and in July of 1861, they met in the Battle of Bull Run, not far from Washington, D.C. The Union troops were defeated, and thus began a long string of defeats for Lincoln and the Union Army. The Peninsular Campaign, the 7 Days Campaign, and the Second Battle of Bull Run all ended in defeat for Union forces.
Lincoln's reaction to the initial series of military setbacks on the side of the Union was despair. There was, again, this feeling of optimism, really on both sides, Union and Confederate. This would be a short-lived thing. Troops were signed up for 3-month enlistments, thinking this thing would be over in a hurry, and these series of setbacks initially were very shocking, I think. Lincoln seeing the troops after Bull Run limping back to Washington was really set it was a reality check almost for the Lincoln administration. This is going to be a long, drawn-out affair, and that they need to do some more work to get ready. So that those military setbacks were just one of a series of challenges Lincoln had to face.
The constant pressure of the war weighed heavily upon Abraham Lincoln. His duties as President and Commander-in-Chief required an enormous amount of time and energy. In addition, he wrote most of his own letters and speeches, and during several hours each day, he would receive virtually anyone who chose to call, leaving the president with little, if any, time for his family. For his wife, Mary, the years in the White House were perhaps even more difficult and brought a great deal of sorrow. Two of Lincoln's sons, Willie and Tad, lived with the family in the White House and provided them with some relief in their private moments. The oldest son, Robert, was away at college much of the time, visiting with the family occasionally. However, tragedy again struck the Lincoln family on February 20th, 1862, when Willie died at the age of 11. Willie was the second child the Lincolns had lost, and his death depressed the president deeply. And Mary Lincoln is said to have never recovered from her grief at their loss. In addition, Mary Lincoln was a Southerner by birth and had many relatives serving in the Confederate Army. Because of this, she faced constant suspicion among people in Washington who doubted her loyalty to the Union. The pressures she felt often resulted in outbursts of anger. In September of 1862, the Union and Confederate armies met in the Battle of Antietam in Maryland. It was a bloody battle. On no other single day would so many Americans be killed, wounded, or missing. 22,719 in all. And although it could hardly be termed a resounding triumph for the North, it was the Confederates who ultimately retreated on the day following the battle. And so it was claimed as a Union victory. President Lincoln visited the battlefield to urge General McClellan to pursue the Confederates. Before the Battle of Antietam, Abraham Lincoln was convinced that the time had come for a change in policy toward slavery, and decided to issue a proclamation freeing the slaves. On the advice of his cabinet, Abraham Lincoln waited for a Union victory before issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, and Antietam fit the bill. On January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that all slaves in states or parts of states that were in rebellion against the Union were free.
I think the Emancipation Proclamation was used as a military tactic. He issued it in September, but it didn't take effect until January of the following year. So in September of 1863,